Curioso, and welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast, episode 266, Classrooms. We're going to look once again at education in this early Edwardian period of Welsh history, this era between about 1890 to about 1913. I want to kind of continue to examine what's going on in this era because there's a lot of change that happens in a very short amount of time. It's something that we don't get a lot of opportunity to discuss past this point because we get very obsessed with World War One. And I think it's important to continue to bring up some of the key points that are happening in such a compact couple of decades. So that's going to be the focus of today's episode, focusing about education reform. At the heart of this period, as Wales builds more schools and more people are learning to read, what are they being taught to read, and in what language are they being taught to read in? And what, of course, did all this mean for the Welsh language? Something, of course, that's near and dear to this podcast's heart and is something that we have to continue to wonder and worry about. This is, of course, not a story of villains and heroes. As always with history, no matter where we're talking, it's more complicated than that, and usually more interesting than that, to be honest with you. The people who built the schools and the libraries of this period were, in the main, Welsh men and women who cared deeply about their country. The reasons, as we mentioned with the social gospelers, that there was such a focus on education was it was felt that it would help people to understand and to get a ability to continue to climb the ladder of economic success. It might not be the social ladder because there were still a lot of restrictions on upward mobility in that respect, but economic success could come to anyone in Britain at this time. And that was something of a pushing point for a lot of people with so much poverty and so many problems happening in the UK at this point, even in England and Scotland, but especially in Wales and Ireland. There is a desire to continue to help in some way, especially amongst those who have a bent towards trying to help their fellow humans, to educate, to continue to grow literacy, which is seen as a key point to help the entirety of society. And there's a big push against what is perceived as ignorance, which is being uneducated, having a lack of an ability to read. All of these things became very important, and a lot of people started to push against it. So let's first talk about the educational landscape of 1890. The Elementary Education Act of 1870, which we mentioned before, had established school boards across England and Wales. It then empowered them to build publicly funded school boards where church provision was inadequate. Of course, at this time, most of the schools we had were formed and created by churches of various denominations. This was starting to change now. The reality was hitting people that we needed more than just the churches trying to do this. By 1880, school attendance had been made compulsory up to the age of 10, and by 1891, elementary education was free of fees. So the basic architecture of mass schooling as we know it today is in place by the time of 1890. What exists above the elementary level, of course, was patchier. There were grammar schools. Most of them were old, endowed foundations, not dissimilar to what we have now, providing secondary education, but they were unevenly distributed, often expensive, and in many Welsh communities, effectively inaccessible to the working class children. In parts of South Wales, rapid growth in industrial populations had simply outpaced whatever educational infrastructure existed. And really, I think a lot of people didn't have a full understanding of what was needed in secondary education. There was a lot of pushback because so many people needed their young people to work. They needed that income coming in. And so it was difficult to justify sending a child who may be in their, young preteens or teenage years into a school to learn when they could be financially contributing to the family. That doesn't mean that's right. Obviously, in our modern sense, we may look at that as being a terrible idea. But at the time, that was a consideration, and it was one of the pushbacks that people had against going and expanding free education to secondary education. It was seen as sort of the playground of the middle class and the rich rather than of the poor. And of course, that would then influence and affect everything below. Because if you can't get the right amount of education, you can't get into university and higher education, you can't necessarily increase your ability to learn and grow in a way that might help that child continue to develop as a human. That kind of thing creates a lot of division. It creates a lot of separation and advantages for the wealthier and higher middle class children because of this. However, it doesn't mean that there weren't opportunities, but they were minimal and they were set to specific people unless you had advantages that you just didn't, up to this point, get access to if you didn't have the money. As to what they did learn when the children were there, elementary schools in this period emphasized literacy, numeracy, and structured around standardized testing. Something that some segments of society still bang on about today is that you need to be able to read, write, and add, and everything else is just an extra. And that's kind of one of those problems that we still have to this day, a discussion about what is the purpose of education and how is it useful. The notorious payment by results system, introduced under the Revised Code of 1862, which tied school funding to pupil performance in reading, writing, and arithmetic examinations. Again, this is something we know a bit about because it still happens today in some areas. There's still this concept that you reward schools who are successful, but don't always consider why they're successful may have nothing to do with the children learning better, but having better opportunity to learn. I know this is complex and it's a very politically divisive topic, but keep that in mind as we talk about these kind of things, because I think they're important to understand. We have to remember that most of Wales at this time, much as it is today, there's economic disadvantages that are going on, even amongst those who are earning money through mining and other labor who are getting union protection at this point. They're still not compensated enough to be able to have a lot of freedom. So having these kind of strictures and ideals in an area where the focus has never been about these things before, I think it's a difficult road for someone to argue. It was a system designed mostly to produce measurable results cheaply. It produced them, of course, though critics argued it narrowed the curriculum and reduced teaching to a rote drilling. Again, something that's been a conversation in schools across the world. I think to my own schooling and the fact that my children there's been a lot of talk about the last month or so of their education being strictly about passing a test and whether or not that's useful. And I can't speak to whether it is or it isn't. I'm not an educator. I've never been in that field. So I don't know. I just know the arguments, but I don't necessarily know which side is right. I think there's arguments to both sides. As always, it's never as easy as this one's definitely right and that one's definitely wrong. Because the last thing you want is you don't want children going through their entire first 6 years of schooling and not learning how to read, not learning how to do simple mathematics, not knowing how to write properly. But that doesn't mean that that's the entire focus of education. Critical thinking is a key part of education. It's something we should be teaching our children. And so should the educators, because it's an important process in trying to help them understand the world around them. Anyway, without going into all the political drama around it, I just wanted to make that point before we go further. On the language question, the picture of the 1890s is complex, as you can imagine. During the 1891 census, the first time anyone made a serious count, Welsh was spoken by about half the population in Wales. Already, we're at half. So it makes you understand just how much English has already moved into the country before we even get to the 1900s. Around 30% were recorded as being unable to speak English. That figure of 30% itself is contested at the time, with some suspecting the question had been poorly framed, the numbers were an overstatement, or even accounting measure difficulties. I would also counter this by also saying that sometimes people might know a language, but to officials and to polling people, they might be disingenuous, shall we say. There was, of course, substantial Welsh monolingualism in rural Wales, especially in the areas like Meirionydd and Cardiganshire, but these were where 3/4 of the people were recorded as speaking Welsh only, which makes perfect sense that they would be Welsh speakers first and maybe not English speakers at all. In elementary schools, though, English had been the language of formal instruction and examination for decades. The famous Welsh not wooden token that became a symbol of linguistic repression, passed from child to child. We've talked a little bit about this and about how there is, to some degree, questions about how widespread and extensive this was. But nonetheless, it was something that was used and is something that has taken on a life of its own as a mythic way of describing the persecution of Welsh in schools in especially the 1800s. This, of course, created its own level of difficulty, because if you have educators that are telling the children not to speak Welsh, to speak English only, who are being encouraged really from home in some cases to do that, because some parents wanted their children to learn English. As we remember from previous discussions, for some parents, it was not that they couldn't speak Welsh. It was that they spoke Welsh first, and these parents, knowing that the economy demanded English, were wanting the educators to teach them in English so that when they came home, they could speak both. And I think that's a little side of this that I think people forget sometimes, that it's not just as simple as, the levers of power were basically controlling this. It was also some of the parents, and it's never as simple as A and B. But nonetheless, it does exist. The myth is not wrong, because it did happen, and there were different methods and different ways of doing that. But again, without going too further down that rabbit hole, that's something to keep in mind, that was also probably one of the reasons why you see the slow drop-off of Welsh being the predominant language in Wales. By the 1890s, of course, this whole process had become less and less common. The use of the Welsh not as something that had ever been really official policy also became changed to protect Welsh, because it had been recognized that this kind of passing of guilt was counterproductive. Children were forbidden from using Welsh to help each other understand, often failed to learn English at all. Welsh began to be used more in the classroom as a practical teaching tool. As historian Martin Jones has argued in his recent study of the subject, the pragmatic use of Welsh made schools more effective mechanisms for Anglicanization, not less. Understanding English was taught through Welsh, and gradually English became the language in which the rising generation thought, worked, and aspired. No different really than if you think, and I mean, this is terrible to think about if we look at this from a Welsh perspective, but a second generation person who's moved to a new country where their language is not predominant, say moving from Asia to North America or to Europe, and having to live and work in a language, there's going to be a push to learn that language, and you're going to be better probably at speaking the language you're living with than you are with the language of home, because it's just simple truth of it. I had friends who had come from another country. They moved to Canada. Over time, if the children were born in the previous country, they spoke that language reasonably well and spoke English as sort of dealing with everybody else. But as kids were born in Canada, those children ended up speaking English first and rarely spoke in their home language, because that was what they had to live with 99% of their life. Home was such a small percentage of their life by the time that you hit school years that it makes perfect sense that you would speak a lot more of the main language you're being taught in school. And I think that's a side effect that I don't think that people understood back in the 1800s, that was going to happen, and that Welsh would slowly be cut out, not because there was a proactive effort to cut it out, but rather because there would be this desire to continue to have success, and it was imagined in a way that English was the way to get success. And because of that, when you go from an industrial or from a rural lifestyle to this industrial lifestyle that they're growing into, more and more English is going to be important. When you're living in a small village in North Wales, and that's where you spend your entire life, live and die, you don't have a reason to use English. But if you want to move to the south, if you want to work in the coal mines, if you want to move to Liverpool, if you want to move to London, all of a sudden English becomes incredibly important and critical to your success. And so all of the efforts in the past to try and weed out, in quotes, the Welsh culture and the Welsh language start to pick up because of this. If Wales had remained a rural backwater, pardon my description, then the language probably stays at the 50 to 75% because there's no reason to try and become, for the large majority of the population, in bed with the English culture and the English language. But as time goes on and as things develop and as the economies progress and people are seeing others who are becoming more and more successful as they continue to work in English, it's an obvious incentive, especially as farm life is dying off in a way. I mean, we're not to the stage of where you have mass industrialization on the farms and you start to see a lot less people actually living there, but we're getting to that point. And I think that's something that becomes something to take note of, that this is what's driving it much more than the old ways of trying to enforce and banter and instruct. It's this insipid way that the language is slowly being expired, if you want to put it that way. And I think that if it had happened, say, 100 years prior to that or 200 years prior to that, I think they would have been as successful as they were in Scotland in driving out the use of Scottish Gaelic or Scots. I think that because it didn't really start to happen until this period, it gave them a fighting chance. It gave Welsh a fighting chance to survive that it may not have had otherwise. Anyway, let's move back into our story as it is. The single most important legislation event for Welsh education in this period actually predates it by a year. The Welsh Intermediate Education Act of 1889 is worth beginning. It's important and it's worth beginning there because the schools it created were coming into their stride about the 1890s and 1900s. The act had its roots in the Aberdare Report of 1881, commissioned by Gladstone's government to examine the state of intermediate and higher education in Wales. The committee, chaired by Henry Bruce, the first Baron of Aberdare, found provision severely deficient. Wales lacked the proper tier of schools between elementary to university, a gap that England and Scotland had begun to address, but which Wales, lacking its own educational administration, had not. The 1889 Act, genuinely distinctive piece of legislation. Unlike its English equivalents, the provision it applied solely to Wales and Monmouthshire. Remember, at this point, Monmouthshire is not a part of Wales. It is still kind of an English county because the official national lines have not been drawn yet. So something to keep in mind if you're unfamiliar with this. So they will say Wales and Monmouthshire quite frequently in the information. And it required county councils to submit schemes for new intermediate schools funded by a combination of county rates and treasury grants. This was Wales receiving something tailored specifically to its circumstances, a product in part of liberal political pressure and the growing assertion of Welsh national identity in Westminster through MPs like T.E. Ellis and slightly later by David Lloyd George himself. The schools that resulted, often called the county schools or intermediate schools, were by the standards of the time a considerable achievement. They provided a secondary curriculum to communities that had previously had nothing above elementary level. They were also crucially free to access via scholarship for the brightest elementary school pupils, which meant that working class children for the first time had the ability and good fortune could aspire to secondary education in Wales. Rates of working class participation in secondary education in Wales were, by the 20th century, measurably higher than in England, a real distinction that contemporaries noted with pride. Yet, the intermediate schools also carried with them a set of assumptions about what education was for and what language it should happen in. The curriculum was academic and oriented towards university entrance and classics. English literature, mathematics, history, modern languages, French and German sometimes, and sciences. It was designed to produce young people who could sit at the examination for the University of Wales and go on to college at Aberystwyth, Bangor, or Cardiff. All of this, almost without exception, took place in English. A big key. There was no structural requirement to teach through Welsh, no provision for the Welsh language examination at intermediate levels until considerably later, no expectation that county schools should serve as defenders of Welsh linguistic culture. The scholars who climbed the ladder from elementary school scholarship to intermediate schools and then on to university were, in many cases, Welsh speakers from Welsh-speaking homes, but the ladder they climbed was framed in English. Amongst those who framed the 1889 Act, the historian W.J. Roderick had observed the primary concern was securing better educational opportunities for the Welsh middle class. Fees meant that even in a new intermediate school, poorest families would often struggle. The minimum school leaving age raised from 10 to 12 years old in 1890s and from 12 to 14 by the Education Act of 1918, meaning that many working class children were expected to work before they could benefit from secondary schooling at all. The Education Act of 1902, known as the Balfour Act, brought further reorganization. It abolished the elected school boards that had administered elementary schools since 1870 and then transferred their responsibilities to county and county borough councils, which became a new local education authority. In Wales, this produced some friction. Welsh county councils were, in many cases, liberal and nonconformist in character. The 1902's Act provisions for public funding of Anglican voluntary schools were bitterly resented. In Merionethshire and several other Welsh counties, there was outright defiance of the Act, a minor administrative revolt that became known as the Welsh Revolt, and it kept education lawyers and politicians occupied for several years. Eventually, the councils came into compliance, but the episode illustrated how sharply educational governance intersected with religious and national politics in Wales. For the children of the classrooms of the 1902's Act, the most tangible effect was that their school was now administered by county council rather than by school board. For many, little changed in practice, but consolidation of education authority at the county level did create a slightly more coherent framework within which, over time, decisions about language of instruction were made for good or for ill. And this has a knock-on effect. Running alongside the above school system was the remarkable story of Welsh higher education of this period. The University College of Wales at Aberystwyth had been founded in 1872. As we've discussed before, the University College of Wales at Aberystwyth was founded in 1872. It was an institution that was founded and funded not by governments, not by major key donors, but rather by a subscription service, which was put in place in order to gain contributions from ordinary Welsh people who wanted their own place in higher learning. University College of South Wales and Monmouthshire at Cardiff followed in 1883, and the University College of North Wales at Bangor in 1884. In 1893, these three colleges received a royal charter as federal universities of Wales. This was, as the university's own historians have acknowledged, regarded at the time as one of the most important political and social developments in the late 19th century in Wales. It gave Wales something that it had lacked since the pre-Reformation dissolution of the monasteries, an indigenous institution of advanced learning, answerable to Welsh needs rather than to English ones. And we mentioned at the time when we talked about this, the fact that there had been a goal by Owen Glyndwr to set up a Welsh university had he succeeded to become and control Wales as the Prince of Wales. But it never happened, and there was never a university ever set up before the 1800s. And yet, the universities of Wales, for all their national significance, conducted its teachings in English, as you can imagine. This was not simply an accident or an oversight. At the level of professional and academic life, English was the language in which science, law, medicine, and theology were practiced across Britain. Welsh students who wanted to enter the professions had to operate in English. This was understood, accepted, and in many cases actively desired by the parents who scraped together the fees and the students who sat the examinations again and again and again. We've talked about this. What the University of Wales did provide was a sense that Welsh people and Welsh culture and Welsh intellectual life had a legitimate place in the modern world. The commitment to Celtic studies, to Welsh history, and to the preservation of Welsh literary heritage in the University College, particularly in Aberystwyth, meant that Welsh language was being studied and celebrated even as it was displaced from ordinary use. This is another of those tensions that is characteristic of the period. The growing institutional investment in the idea of Welsh culture coexisting with a structural pressure that made Welsh a less and less practical daily language for those who aspired to get on with it. It's worth pausing to say something concrete about what was happening in the Welsh classroom at this period, because the picture is more varied than either the school destroyed Welsh or the schools had no effect on the language would suggest. In rural North and West Wales, Carnarvonshire, Merionethshire, Cardiganshire, and Anglesey, elementary schools throughout the 1890s and 1900s were teaching large numbers of Welsh-speaking children. In these areas, teachers were often Welsh speakers themselves, and Welsh was used in the classroom as a matter of practical necessity. In 1901, a full 10% of 15-year-olds in Wales were recorded as being unable to speak English despite more than 20 years of compulsory schooling, which tells us something important about the limits of schooling as an agent of language change. In Welsh-speaking communities, the community was more powerful transmitter of language than any classroom. Before the First World War, it was more common for English-speaking migrants to settle in rural Welsh communities and to learn Welsh from their neighbors than it was for local people to abandon the language. Census records from this period show that the children of English-born families in rural Wales often were speaking Welsh, learned in the community with their peers and not in school. In South Wales, the picture, of course, is different. As it is today, the rapidly expanding valley towns in the eastern coalfields, such as Aberdare, Rhondda, and Merthyr Tydfil, and their satellite settlements were receiving huge numbers of English migrants and English-speaking migrants at that, and social pressures that ran in opposite directions from what was happening in the rural areas. Welsh-speaking families instead were arriving from rural Wales and were within a generation or two raising their children who were more comfortable in English than Welsh, and intermediate schools in the valleys were teaching only in English. The workmen institutes and their libraries stocked English books. Newspapers in circulation were predominantly English. By 1901, the proportion of Welsh speakers in the Rhondda had fallen from 64% and would continue to fall to 55% by 1911. The question of formal Welsh language instruction in schools was beginning to be raised by the 1890s. A code revision in 1893 allowed Welsh to be taught as a class subject in Welsh-speaking elementary schools. Recognition at last that the language had an educational value. But this did not mean Welsh became the language of instruction. It meant that Welsh could be timetabled along with other subjects. The distinction matters. Teaching a child about Welsh in English is quite different from teaching a child in Welsh. In a way, you think about it, it's like if you take a child and they have a class where they learn another language in that class, say Spanish or German or French, or in this case, Welsh, how much do you continue to input compared to a child who's in an immersion school where all conversation and communication is done in one language, even if the language of home is different? I had two children that took French immersion, and because of it, they still, to this day, as adults, can speak a level of French. Are they as good as they would be if they were native speakers? No. Are they as good if they had lived in a French-speaking environment? If at home we spoke French? No, obviously not. But do they understand it much better than I would in the circumstance of taking a class once a day for 3 years in elementary and middle school? They're a lot better than I am because I don't remember any French other than very basic stuff. And that's from taking it at university even. I still am terrible with French. If you know my Welsh, you would understand why. But it's one of those things, though, where they have learned and they've learned better. So that's a major difference. And the fact that they're teaching Welsh is just kind of another course like, say, French or Spanish or German is shows that while there's a level of respect, it's not a top level respect. Some of the county schools established under the 1889 Act did include Welsh on their timetables, and a handful of dedicated teachers and educational administrators argued energetically for more substantial place for the language, but the dominant current was against them. The examinations at open doors were in English medium. The professors at universities and at higher education were English medium professors. Even many of the Welsh-speaking parents, if asked, would have said that English was what their children need to get on in the world. And of course they're not wrong, given the economic and social realities of late Victorian and Edwardian Britain. The choice was not always experienced as a loss. It was often experienced as a practical necessity, sometimes a mark of advancement. And I think that's something to keep in mind. I think it's very easy when we look back at this period and the results of what happens because of this, and to feel a sense of loss if you are someone who wanted the Welsh language to grow and continue to progress to be something that it's getting closer to these days, but it's still a long way off, where it's the predominant language of the community. It's just, this is where it starts to wear out. And it's not done out of animosity. It's not done out of institutional destruction, but rather it's done out of economics. And pure and simple, that's what's causing the problem. And all of that is horrendous for the language, but it's totally understandable from the standpoint of most people. For most people, you can absolutely understand why they're doing this, why they're viewing it that way. And some would argue even today a similar direction. I think there are some people within Wales who look at Welsh as being in the way. You know, why do we have to learn this language that is a, in quotes, dead language, instead of getting on with it and just becoming a part and speaking the English language that everybody does? But I think it's too simplistic. It's too easy to go that route. I think we have to understand that. I think over time people are getting it, but I think we're still a long way off from that. You can walk into stores now and Welsh is the first thing you see on everything. That's something of a big step forward. I can honestly say I remember 20 years ago walking into Welsh stores, and Welsh was not the first thing you saw on most things. In fact, I hardly ever saw Welsh on any labels. And over time, we've seen it go from being sort of a side thing to being predominant. Now, if you walk into a store, you will see Welsh language cards and things on everything so that you can see it. It's in your face. It's more evident. And as much as people may not like that, if they don't speak Welsh, they at least recognize that it's there. Yes, we've got a long way to go before people are going to be largely bilingual. But I think that the only way we get there is by this slow progress. Again, I don't want to get into the whole politics of it. I think that's not my place, especially as a very monolingual person, as everybody knows from the amount of discussions there are about how I pronounce things sometimes. Yet, at the same time, I think it's important for us to be mindful of all of this, because everything that we can do to maintain the language of Wales helps Wales to progress, helps Wales to become what it is, which is an individual nation rather than just a nation consumed by the bigger nation that invaded it, 800, almost, closing in on 800 years ago. That kind of thing is something we, as those who have, I'm sure if you listen to this podcast, largely you have some reason to listen to the podcast. Maybe you're Welsh yourself. Maybe you have Welsh ancestry. Maybe you just like the place because you've been there. All of those things are reasons why we keep pushing the agenda of the language. And while we understand the reasons why it started to die out, there's no excuse for not pushing forward and maintaining a language that is, by its very nature, one of the oldest in the world. And I think that's something that is valuable. Outside of everything else, outside of the fact that it has links to my own ancestors who all spoke Welsh, up to my grandparents who they themselves spoke Welsh as their first language, all of those people, I think the best way we can help to continue to present the culture is by presenting the language. Again, I realize other people listening to this podcast will disagree. That's okay. But I think it's important. I think it still remains important. And, whether you say chips or sclodion, or if you, can see it and know exactly what it refers to without having to look at the English word, I think that's a good thing. I think it builds a level of understanding that all of us need in order to get to a place where the language is just as important to everyone in the country. And I think that's a critical aspect to building out from the position of being an ever weakening thing to being an ever strengthening thing. And with all of that moralizing, let me just cut it there. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can always reach me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com. You can reach out to me on social media at Welsh History Pod. Or if you'd like to, you can also help the podcast out at patreon.com/Welsh History. We're definitely trying to continue by putting videos there that are Patreon-only videos. I hope you've watched them. I hope you give feedback. I'd love to know what you think. And more will be going up. And with all that said, and with all that done, I hope you all have a great day. Talk to you later. Take care. Diolch yn fawr. Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcasts.com. Thanks for listening.